At the end, there was something light and bright, and I also realized that I wanted to go there. And this light was just so beautiful and warm, and I got closer and closer. And I also realized that I was very close to the light, that it pulled me into it somehow. And I also wanted to go there. And I also realized that it was something like a merge with this light. And this experience was truly wonderful. It was the most beautiful thing I had experienced in my life so far.
Mrs. Brekenfeld, you are a healer for psychotherapy and your work is also built on a very special life experience. As far as I'm aware, you got into a life-threatening situation while you were heavily pregnant, and you had an experience that is considered to be a near-death experience today. What exactly happened at the time?
Es war vor fast 15 Jahren, im Juli 2004. Und wie Sie gerade schon sagten, ich war hochschwanger.
It happened almost 15 years ago in July 2004. And as you've mentioned before, I was heavily pregnant. And the date of birth was just around the corner. And on that day, I don't exactly know what happened there. I actually don't know why something like this can happen. But my placenta loosened itself prematurely. And a premature placenta previa means that you start bleeding a lot. Shortly before birth, the placenta is about as big as a small pizza, and when it loosens itself, severe bleedings occur, and the life of both the mother and the child are in danger. That is what happened to me, namely from 1 minute to the next. So it wasn't predictable at all. I was still lying in bed in the morning and suddenly I noticed that I had severe bleedings and they were that strong that I instantly knew if I don't get help right now, I'm gonna die. Well, I became aware of it instantly because of all the blood I saw. And at that moment I realized, or let's say at that moment this thought popped up in my head that if I couldn't get help straight away, I'd die. At that moment, the severe fear of death hit me. And I was still able to react. I called the emergency. I called my husband, and then I noticed that my whole body started shivering. My teeth were chattering. My whole vegetative nervous system started fighting against this impending death that was suddenly and unexpectedly a possibility. And the crazy thing was that in this situation I heard something like an inner voice that denied everything that was happening at the moment. And it was also like an inner voice that said, everybody dies, but not me. And at the same time, I knew that it was actually happening at that moment. And of course, this was a situation I would have never expected to happen. Never. Because until now, I had the feeling that I'd been in control of my life. And somehow everything was, I'd say everything had gone well at the time. I had a good job, we just got married, my husband and I, and now our first child was on the way. And during that situation, I realized that everything was different now, and that I didn't have any control anymore. That was a totally new situation for me, and also to realize that I had actually lost control of what was happening. And I also noticed how my whole body was fighting against this. Like, I don't want this to happen. I don't want to die. And this fear of death grew massively. Of course, the emergency physician and the paramedic came in, and from their reactions I could see that it was really serious. They were all horrified by in which state they were finding me in. I can't really describe why this happened. It was like an inner capitulation to what was happening. It was like, okay, I surrender. And during this surrender, everything changed, because with this, I surrender, my whole consciousness extended from my body, and I experienced it as something that was bigger than my body. And all of a sudden, I perceived the whole experience out of my body. I saw the extent of my blood loss. I also saw my body lying there. There was this risk of dying. I saw the paramedic, the emergency physician, all the agitation and fear. And looking at myself, peace and tranquility came over me, and everything went quiet. It was as if time had stopped. And all the fear that I'd had before, all the fighting just stopped at that moment. It was incredibly quiet. And I could see everything that was happening, and at the same time, I made my peace with it. And then this thought popped up in my head. I'm not this body. And another crazy thing was that I was still able to hear and think, and that I wasn't in this body anymore. And at that moment, I experienced something like a suction that pulled me. When I'm talking about me, that I'm talking about, let's call it a consciousness that was outside of my body. And this consciousness was pulled into something like narrowness, a confinement. Oftentimes people report of something like a tunnel, or the term tunnel is being used. But I realized that the word narrowness fits way better for my experience. At the beginning, I also called it tunnel because it's such a fixed word, and this narrowness was dark and somehow moving. And also golden orange, dark golden orange. And it pulled me through this narrowness. At the end, there was something light and bright. And I also realized that I wanted to go there. And this light was just so beautiful and warm and safe. And I got closer and closer. And I also realized that I was very close to the light, that it pulled me into it somehow. And I also wanted to go there. And I also realized that it was something like a merge with this light. And this experience was truly wonderful. It was the most beautiful thing I had experienced in my life so far. It was full of safety and quietness, full of love and peace. And it was really a feeling as if I had arrived at home. Also feeling like I belong here.
What happened then? How did you experience the way back?
Also, wie ich genau zurückgekommen bin, weiß ich gar nicht. Also da.
Well, I don't know how I got back exactly. I don't have any memory of that. I know that I woke up in my body again, in the intensive care ward in hospital. And I was surrounded by thousands of cables. And the first thing I thought was, it can't be that I'm back in here again. To wake up in this very badly injured body was a big disappointment. Well, it was like, I thought, this can't be true. Now I'm back here again. And the second thought was, how can I get out of here again? Yes, that's what it was like. And at that moment, I also had this memory of going inside and outside. And I was outside of my body, and it was possible. Well, I could remember all the details very well. The body was severely injured. I had lost a lot of blood, and they had to perform an emergency surgery to save my life. And thus my body was very weak, and it felt really cold. It probably had something to do with the emergency surgery as well. In any case, I had the feeling that being back in this body was very tight, very cold and totally uncomfortable.
So you woke up in this body, you were confronted with consequences of this event, but at the same time, you were carrying this wonderful experience in you. What happened in the following weeks and months?
Well, the beginning was very difficult. At the beginning, at first, I didn't know how I should continue living my life. Because I had the feeling that my previous life had just stopped. It was like a stop. And something that's also important to mention is the fact that my little boy hadn't survived. He died, and of course at first I was occupied with the mourning of my son, and that life had taken a completely different turning. Of course my surroundings just saw that I almost died, and that I had lost a child. For them, this was a huge tragedy and drama, and for the members of my family as well. My husband had lost his son, my parents had lost their grandchild, and my sister had lost her nephew. And at the beginning, I was too scared to tell anybody about this experience. I thought they'd call me crazy if I told them that I'd also experienced some beautiful moments during the biggest drama of my life. I didn't even dare tell my husband about it.
Did you ever know the term near-death experience at the time?
No, I didn't know about it at the time. Of course. Well, I was staying in hospital until I was physically fit again. And then I was already thinking about telling somebody about it. But then I thought, no, if I tell them anything about my experience, they'll transfer me into the psychiatric ward. So you can see I was quite careful. In the first weeks I was staying in hospital, I just noticed that something had changed. Because although there was this pain and grief due to all the experiences, I still felt this peace and love that carried me through those difficult times. I felt like getting back on my feet again. That's what it felt like. And I didn't have any idea what a near-death experience was. And when I came back home, we've got this very big bookshelf, and for whatever reason, it pulled me towards it. And all of a sudden, I took out Raymond Moody's book, Life After Death. And when I was reading that, I knew instantly, okay, that I'd had a near-death experience. And that's something I found very thrilling, and it also supported me a lot. But I realized instantly, or rather quickly, that I was very interested in the topic. So on the one hand, I knew I had a near-death experience, but on the other hand, I was asking myself how I could continue my life with this knowledge. What am I gonna do now? And with whom can I even speak about these experiences? I then started a psychotherapy, and I realized rather quickly that I had reached all the limits with my therapist, because she couldn't cope with the fact that I constantly wanted to speak about death. I always tried to cope with this experience via death, but I didn't even get that far, because I realized how difficult it is for people to speak about death.
Even for the therapist?
Yes, even for the therapist. It was so difficult for her that she didn't even want to hear my experiences with death, and unfortunately, she made the wrong diagnosis because she thought I was suicidal and that it would be best for me to be sent to a mental hospital. And she was really worried that I would kill myself because my son was dead too. So she made a completely different connection. And of course that was very bitter for me. That's something I have to mention because I had the feeling, okay, apparently there's nobody with whom I can really speak with about this experience here. I'd been hopeful that I would be able to speak with a therapist about it, and that I'd be able to speak about the beauty of this experience too. And I then quickly realized that there aren't many people with whom I can speak to about this experience. You can take this. My surroundings, my circle of friends said, just stop it. We don't want to hear anything about death. Just be glad that you're still alive. And I realized I was happy that I was still alive, but that there was still something else I could feel at all times. It wasn't like a memory for me when I was talking about it. It was more substantial. Something had changed. Well, and then I went for a search because I realized that I was really interested in what I had experienced. I still knew that I wasn't that body. There was something else. I suddenly realized that space and time can be blurred, that consciousness can apparently extend, and I was very curious and wanted to know what experience I'd had. Well, then I went to see a few therapists and looked around if I'd find other people, other therapists I'd be able to speak to about this topic. Thank God I found somebody. I mean a therapist who said yes, and who even listened to me, and he said, yes, I know such experiences do exist, and it would be good if you looked for someone who's made such experiences as well, and who is an expert in this field. I'm not an expert. And even today, I'm still thankful he said that, because then it was suddenly clear to me, I need somebody who really knows about such experiences and who can classify them. Because at that point, it hadn't been clear to me that the others hadn't been able to classify my experience. And just because they couldn't classify it, they didn't even want to take a look at it. It became more and more clear to me that my surroundings didn't mean any harm by doing that. Although at the beginning it was very painful that I couldn't speak with anybody about it.
You've written a book with a very appealing title, Encounter Death and Gain Life. In your book, you describe the spiritual and transforming power of near-death experiences. If you summarize that, what has this power done to you over the past years? How has it changed you?
Well, the most wonderful thing about this transforming power is that I'm not scared of life anymore. Well, that's more or less the most important message, if I had to summarize it. Well, many people ask me, is it true that you're not scared of death anymore? And then I usually say, yes, it truly feels like it, but I'll only know for sure when death returns. I just noticed that certain things have stopped, that I'm not scared of heights anymore, that I'm not so scared of many things anymore. This is what stopped. In summary, I'd say that I'm not scared of life anymore, but that life feels totally alive.
You offer therapeutic support to people who've had a near-death experience. What would you generally advise? How can it work to integrate such an experience into daily life?
Well, I think the first thing that is really important is to look for somebody you can really talk to about it. So this experience gets room. Well, when people come to see me, they often tell me, "You're the first person I can really talk to about this and who really listens." Sometimes it's also like that people come to me who've had to deal with death in a different way. And so I'd ask, "Tell me, is there some special experience you've made in this context?" And then they oftentimes say, "Yes, but I've never told anybody about it."
So it's just relieving to talk about it.
Yes. It's a relief to talk about it, about experiences that are outside of our, let's say, everyday consciousness. And that they really exist, without anybody saying, such crazy stuff. And that's the first step.
You're also open to other spiritual experiences. From your point of view, which other similarities are there to near-death experiences?
Well, I dealt with it a lot when I was doing the research for my book. And I looked for answers for the question what mystical spiritual experiences are. I also looked into how mystic spiritual experiences can be categorized, and clients often say, "Well, I've got the feeling that what I experienced was actually reality." That's what it was. And for example, if somebody reads old texts of Christian mystics, like Master Eckhart, Teresa of Avila, John Tauler, also St. Francis of Assisi, then you can find such reports as well. And in their texts you can also find that such experiences can be long-lasting. And I've also looked into, let's say, modern spiritual paths as well, because there is a wide spectrum. And I think it's very important to take a closer look. And the whole topic surrounding awakening, enlightenment, what does this actually mean? And I discovered while doing so that reports of people who have made such experiences through meditation and spiritual work, that they're similar to reports of people who've had near-death experiences. And during my work that I also studied later on, because I realized that I didn't get much support, it soon became clear to me that I also wanted to support people who dealt with death too, in whatever way, that I wanted to help them to integrate this experience into their everyday life. And I also looked into various levels of consciousness, and that we've got a level that's our everyday consciousness that is set in space and time, and that there is another level, which I call level of consciousness. It's a vertical level, where it is about how deeply I'm connected to myself. And the more this level decreases, and the fewer times I stay in this level, the more often I go into this vertical level, into this level of consciousness, into an inner level. This level is here too, but most of the time we're busy here in this level. That's just what everyday life entails. And I think that during a near-death experience, at least that's how I experienced it as well, that during that time, the sense of space and time that we have in everyday life just stops. And that there is a moment where we fall into this vertical level of consciousness. It is the thing that is mentioned in many spiritual paths, to be in the here and now, to be in the moment. Because people who work on themselves on a spiritual level have reported of similar experiences as people who've had a near-death experience. They report of getting in touch with something that is full of love, full of peace and happiness, where it is quiet and where time doesn't exist. And when I work with people who integrate their near-death experiences into their lives, then it's an important next step to take a look at what hinders somebody to stay permanently in touch with these inner experiences, with this inner level. A near-death experience is often connected to a traumatic event. That was the case with me. It means that the body is in a stressful situation and thinks that it has to be in a flight or fight mode. That's what also happens during an accident or other life-threatening events. This means that the body repeatedly has the feeling that if it gets in touch with this peaceful, let's say luminous experience, that something dangerous will happen. And speaking of my experiences, it's important to disconnect the two again, because eventually the body has to be taken into this peaceful or luminous experience as well. And I've made this great experience with trauma healers in a way that people were able to resolve these physical reactions that can always occur after a near-death experience. And because of that, the contact to this luminous experience can be permanent. And the deep longing of people to return to this can be something that is permanent throughout one's life.
I'd like to return to the topic of death, but talk about it in more general terms. For most people, death is connected to the pain of farewell, to sorrow, to things that seem uncomfortable. According to the title of your book, however, it is possible to gain life by encountering death. What can our own mortality teach us? What use is it to deal with death prematurely?
Well, I think it is important to deal with it prematurely because we can discover what's essential in life to us through our own mortality. Then I can discover what's really important to me. And through my own mortality, I can actually get in touch with this inner space that seems to be present at all times. That's my interpretation, believe it's placed in our hearts, an inner space where peace, happiness, and love exist that are unconditional. And many people long for this. Many people are on a spiritual quest. And death can help us get in touch with it. Let's say our own potential of our lives. Because when we live outside of this inner space and with the potential and power that has been given to us, only then can our lives become really powerful. And only then is it possible to be fearless of life while we're still alive.
Earlier, you described rather beautifully that you've lost the fear of life. What do you think is behind this widespread fear of death? Is it the fear of life?
Yes, of course. I think it's actually about the fear of life, because of course death can happen any time. That's the way it is. That's how I experienced it. We don't have control over it. And if I open up to life, I really live it as it comes and with all its vibrancy. Of course, I also open up to the possibility that I could die any moment. And I'm okay with that. And when I open up to this possibility and say, all right, I could die any moment, and I'm okay with it, then I can live life to the full. If I'm always on guard not to die and try to have everything in control so nothing will happen, then I'm driving through life with the handbrake on. And that's why I think, or I'd recommend every person to deal more with death or their own death. I think death is a part of life.
Mrs. Brekenfeld, many thanks for the touching insights into your life. Thank you very much for the interview.
Yes, many thanks. I'd like to thank you as well.